The news now on BBC One with Huw Edwards and Asad Ahmed.
Turmoil at the BBC. Lord Hutton's report denounces its handling of the David Kelly affair. Tonight, the BBC chairman resigns, voicing doubts about the report's findings. Lord Hutton clears the government of any blame in the events leading to Dr. Kelly's death.
The allegation that I or anyone else lied to this House or deliberately misled the country by falsifying intelligence on weapons of mass destruction is itself the real lie.
This evening, the BBC ponders its wider response to the Hutton broadside. We'll have all the reaction to the report and the latest word on what is happening inside the BBC. Also tonight, blizzards and freezing temperatures spread south through Britain. And in Gaza, 8 Palestinians have died in an Israeli army raid.
And in BBC London news, snow hits the capital and as predicted, large parts of our transport system fail. We also bring you the very latest travel information as thousands of people struggle home.
Good evening. The BBC has been thrown into turmoil by the damning verdict of Lord Hutton on its editorial standards, its management and its Board of Governors. The Hutton report into the death of the weapons expert Dr. David Kelly cleared Mr. Blair and the government of any blame. Tonight, the BBC chairman, Gavin Davies, resigned, but he insisted that some of the report's conclusions needed to be questioned. Lord Hutton's main findings were as follows. He said reporter Andrew Gilligan's most serious allegations against the government were unfounded. He said the BBC's editorial system was defective. He said the BBC governors had failed to investigate the government's complaint properly. He said the government had no dishonourable or underhand strategy to reveal Dr. Kelly's identity. And he concluded that Dr. Kelly had taken his own life because he felt he'd been publicly disgraced. Our first report tonight is from Nicholas Witchell.
Exposed as perhaps never before, BBC headquarters tonight, senior officials under pressure, the chairman of governors, Gavin Davies, already gone, resigning, he said, because it was the honourable thing to do. This morning, nearly 4 months after he retired to write his report, Lord Hutton arrived at the Royal Courts of Justice to set out his conclusions. He gave a lengthy televised statement. He dealt first with the cause of Dr. Kelly's death.
That I'm satisfied that Dr. Kelly took his own life. I'm further satisfied that there was no involvement by a third person in Dr. Kelly's death.
The events which drove Dr. Kelly to commit suicide were set out by Lord Hutton. Central to those events, the BBC reporter Andrew Gilligan and his claim that Dr. Kelly had questioned details in the government's Iraq dossier, specifically the 45-minute claim.
The allegations reported by Mr. Gilligan on the BBC Today programme on the 29th of May 2003 that the government probably knew that the 45 minutes claim was wrong or questionable before the dossier was published, and that it was not inserted in the first draft of the dossier because it only came from one source, and the intelligence agencies did not really believe it was necessarily true, were unfounded.
For the BBC, it got worse. Director General and Editor-in-Chief Greg DYKE and senior executives were accused of being at fault in a number of respects. Editorial systems were defective, and editors and BBC governors failed to check whether Gilligan's story could be relied upon.
The very unusual and specific circumstances relating to Mr. Gilligan's broadcast, the governors are to be criticised for themselves failing to make more detailed investigations into whether this allegation reported by Mr. Gilligan was properly supported by his notes, and for failing to give proper and adequate consideration to whether the BBC should publicly acknowledge that this very grave allegation should not have been broadcast.
For the Prime Minister and virtually every government witness, Lord Hutton's findings could hardly have been more different. They were exonerated of any improper behaviour, most importantly in relation to the way in which Dr. Kelly's name became known to the media.
As I've stated, I'm satisfied that there was not a dishonourable or underhand or duplicitous strategy on the part of the Prime Minister and officials to leak Dr. Kelly's name covertly, Therefore, I consider that the question and answer material used by the MOD press office on the 9th of July was not an underhand way of covertly making Dr. Kelly's name public.
The only mild criticism was of the Ministry of Defence, which, Lord Hutton said, could have done more to help Dr. Kelly after the media had discovered his identity.
It must have been a great shock and very upsetting for him to have been told in a brief telephone call from his line manager, Dr. Wells, on the evening of the 9th of July, that the press office of his own department had confirmed his name to the press, and must have given rise to a feeling that he'd been badly let down by his employer.
Lord Hutton concluded that the Prime Minister's former communications chief, ALASTAIR Campbell, did not act improperly in making drafting suggestions to the government's dossier on Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. Suggestions which were considered by John Scarlett, the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the JIC. Again, there was just one small area of concern.
However, I consider that the possibility cannot be completely ruled out that the desire of the Prime Minister to have a dossier which, whilst consistent with the available intelligence, was as strong as possible in relation to the threat posed by said of his aides WMD, may have subconsciously influenced Mr. Scarlett and the other members of the JIC to make the wording of the dossier somewhat stronger than it would have been if it had been contained in a normal JIC assessment.
Finally, there was Dr. Kelly himself. Lord Hutton said he should never have gone to meet the BBC's Andrew Gilligan.
Dr. Kelly's meeting with Mr. Gilligan was unauthorised, and in meeting Mr. Gilligan and discussing intelligence matters with him, Dr. Kelly was acting in breach of the Civil Service Code of Procedure which applied to him.
David Kelly took his life, Lord Hutton said, because he felt people had lost trust in him. He concluded his statement by recalling a tribute to David Kelly, the scientist and public servant.
It is most important that the extraordinary public attention and political fallout arising from the events of the past months do not mask the extraordinary achievements of a scientist who loyally served not only his country, but also the international community at large.
And that was it. Lord Hutton's work was finished. For David Kelly's family, though, the anguish continues.
They urge that, regardless of any criticism or exoneration in the report, the government takes action to ensure that the ordeal suffered by David Kelly will never be repeated.
This inquiry began in the sweltering days of last August, when memories of the Iraq War were still fresh. It's ended in the depths of winter with this comprehensive clinical report. A report which, without question, marks one of the worst moments for the BBC in recent memory. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Royal Courts of Justice.
The BBC's governors have been meeting this evening. They issued a statement saying they had reluctantly accepted the resignation of the chairman, Gavin Davies. He, in turn, made it clear that he questioned some of Lord Hutton's conclusions. The corporation's Director General, Greg Dyke, said the BBC accepted that some key allegations made by Andrew Gilligan were wrong. Mr. Dyke apologised for them. Gavin Hewitt looks at the detail of Lord Hutton's attack on the BBC.
The BBC has never suffered criticism like today. Lord Hutton attacked its editorial values, its management and its journalism. In their worst fears, the managers inside here did not expect this, and today they were reeling in crisis. Among those arriving was the reporter Andrew Gilligan. His story had accused the government of including information in the Iraqi dossier, knowing it was probably wrong. Lord Hutton said that this central charge was unfounded. ALASTAIR Campbell, the government's former spokesman, had been accused of sexing up the dossier. He complained bitterly, but the BBC stood firm, saying they had an excellent source. Lord Hutton today doubted that Dr. Kelly had actually said what Gilligan reported.
I'm satisfied that Dr. Kelly did not say to Mr. Gilligan that the government probably knew or suspected that the 45 minutes claim was wrong before that claim was asserted in the dossier.
Over the summer, the BBC had robustly defended the Gilligan story, but Lord Hutton said there had been no proper editorial control.
I consider that the editorial system which the BBC permitted was defective, in that Mr. Gilligan was allowed to broadcast his report at 6:07 a.m. without editors having seen a script of what he is going to say and having considered whether it should be approved.
He was also critical of the BBC's Director of News, Richard Sambrook. He had failed to see that Gilligan's notes did not fully support the broadcast story. As for the BBC's Board of Governors, they too had failed to thoroughly investigate what they were defending. This afternoon, ALASTAIR Campbell, exonerated by Lord Hutton, launched a stinging attack on the BBC.
The Prime Minister told the truth, the government told the truth, I told the truth. The BBC, from the Chairman and Director General down, did not.
And he wanted far more than an apology.
If the government had faced the level of criticism which today Lord Hutton has directed at the BBC, there would clearly have been resignations by now. Several resignations at several levels.
Minutes later, the BBC's Director General was admitting mistakes.
The BBC does accept that certain key allegations reported by Andrew Gilligan on the Today programme on May the 29th last year were wrong, and we apologise for them.
But Greg Dyke also defended the BBC.
Dr. Kelly was a credible source. Provided his allegations were reported accurately, the public in a modern democracy had a right to be made aware of them. The greater part of the BBC's coverage of the dossier fulfilled this purpose.
Shortly after, the BBC chairman, Gavin Davis, resigned, but only after much agonising, for it's clear he had doubts about some of what was in Lord Hutton's report. For instance, Gavin Davis questions whether it's possible to reconcile what he calls Lord Hutton's bald conclusions with the evidence presented to him during the inquiry. Tomorrow, the BBC governors will meet again, and they will have to decide whether one resignation is enough. And there is an argument going on here. Nearly everyone accepts that mistakes were made, but some senior BBC managers believe that Lord Hutton's report was too harsh on the corporation, too one-sided and too sparing of the government. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News.
Well, our media correspondent, Nick Heim, is at BBC Broadcasting House. Nick, after this unprecedented attack, what can you tell us about the way the corporation is now handling this crisis?
Well, to judge by the way it's behaved today, not terribly well. There's a sense, I think, of some degree of shell shock and of a corporation uncertain to about how to react as the day has gone on, and the storm of criticism has swirled about it, made worse, of course, by the fact that, as Gavin was saying, BBC stands pretty much alone accused of mistakes, and the government has got off pretty lightly. The governors are still here having an informal meeting this evening. They're having dinner at the moment. As Gavin said, they'll be back for a formal meeting tomorrow. We can't rule out more resignations, but exactly what they will decide, I don't know. When I went upstairs a few minutes ago to try and find out a bit more, I was politely asked to leave.
Well, Mr Davis, the former chairman now, obviously made some rather pointed remarks in his statement of resignation, raising some points about the conclusions of Lord Hutton. What did you make of that, Nick?
I think in that he's undoubtedly reflecting the views of a lot of BBC staff who think that it was a rather one-sided report. We don't know if he's also reflecting the views of his fellow governors or former fellow governors. Undoubtedly, the BBC was always going to be criticised, but I think the assumption had always been that the government also would come in for its share of criticism. I think it will be interesting to see how tomorrow morning's newspapers read this and whether they pick up on this as well. If they do, it's possible that the BBC may feel emboldened to fight back to some extent. But certainly, Gavin Davis's departing statement, resignation statement, makes it quite clear he thinks that not all Lord Hutton's conclusions were right, and he also thinks that Lord Hutton's report in the long run might threaten the independence of the BBC.
Nick Heim at Broadcasting House, thank you very much. Well, if the report was much worse than the BBC had feared, it was much better than the government had dared hope. The Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary, senior officials were all cleared of blame in the events that led to Dr Kelly's death. James Robbins now assesses Lord Hutton's verdict on the government.
September 2002. Reporters scrambled from Downing Street with hot news. The government dossier building a case against Saddam Hussein. An unprecedented dossier based on top-secret intelligence material. And the crown jewels in Tony Blair's new armoury?
He has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes including...
Controversial, yes, but today Lord Hutton, at the end of his inquiry, judges there was nothing improper about that claim or the dossier's language, even if, the judge says, the original intelligence is eventually shown to be unreliable. Crucially, the judge exonerates both John Scarlett, the intelligence chief in charge of writing the dossier, and ALASTAIR Campbell, who the judge says was entitled to suggest changes to strengthen it.
Mr. Scarlett accepted some of the drafting suggestions made to him by 10 Downing Street, but he only accepted those suggestions which were consistent with the intelligence known to the JIC, and he rejected those suggestions which were not consistent with such intelligence.
So the judge's seal of approval on the government's dossier. Tony Blair was on a trip to the Far East when news of David Kelly's suicide broke. He flatly denied authorising the naming of Dr. Kelly and simply ignored this bald accusation from a journalist.
Have you got blood on your hands, Prime Minister? Are you going to resign over this?
The Prime Minister said nothing. But it wasn't just him under fire. The Defence Secretary, Jeff Hoon, was widely condemned for failing to protect David Kelly, one of his civil servants. Again, Lord Hutton today cleared both politicians.
The Ministry of Defence here is the only government department specifically criticised by Lord Hutton, and that criticism focuses on its handling of David Kelly and its concern sometimes for his welfare.
In particular, David Kelly should have been warned before his name became public, and when it did, he should have been told more quickly. But still, Lord Hutton did not condemn the overall strategy.
I think that in this case it was recognised by the MOD that because Dr. Kelly's name was bound to come out, and because the issue was one of great importance, it was better to be frank with the press and confirm the correct name if it was given.
Even where Lord Hutton does criticise the government, he finds mitigating circumstances. It all serves to underline that it's not the political and civil service machine on Whitehall where the weight of his criticism is directed. James Robbins, BBC News.
Minutes after the report was published, the Prime Minister rose to address MPs in Parliament. He revealed the depth of his anger at the allegations which had been made against him and against colleagues, allegations which had been judged unfounded. He demanded an apology from the BBC, and he was involved in bitter exchanges with Michael Howard, the Conservative leader. Let's go over to Mark Mardell at Westminster.
This has clearly been a devastating day for the BBC, but a glorious and unexpected one, perhaps, for the government. It really is hard to see how this report could be any better for the government. It clears Tony Blair, Jeff Hoon and all the top officials of doing anything wrong whatsoever. It's humiliated the government's enemies and deprived the opposition of really any ammunition. Today we saw Tony Blair triumphant. No wonder he's smiling. Many expected Tony Blair to be damaged today, perhaps even destroyed. But for weeks, he's confidently urged them to wait for the judge to do the judging. For him, it was well worth the wait.
The report itself is an extraordinarily thorough, detailed and clear document. It leaves no room for doubt or interpretation. We accept it in full.
And no wonder. Michael Howard has persistently questioned whether the Prime Minister has told the truth about this affair. Today, Mr Blair could strike back, supported by the full authority of Lord Hutton.
The allegation that I or anyone else lied to this House or deliberately misled the country by falsifying intelligence on weapons of mass destruction is itself the real lie.
Friends and foes alike in this chamber thought Jeff Hoon would resign today, a sacrificial victim, but in the report, not a hint of criticism.
My right honourable friend in particular has been subject to a constant barrage of such claims as parts of the media have alternated between wanting his scalp or mine. I hope that these attacks on him also over this issue now cease.
Michael Howard had prepared for this moment for ages. He'd pored over the inquiry evidence and believed with his debating skills he could rip the Prime Minister to bits. He hadn't counted on Lord Hutton cutting the ground from under his feet.
Isn't there the starkest contrast between David Kelly, the dedicated scientist and weapons inspector who had done so much for our country, and the cabal of ministers and advisers, including the Prime Minister himself, who were so obsessed with their war with the BBC that they gave scant attention to his welfare.
No apology then, so already wound-up Labour MPs started booing. for just about the first time Mr Blair won hands down.
Yesterday was a test of policy for the right honourable gentleman, and he failed it. Today is a test. Today is a test of character, and he has failed that too.
The Liberal Democrats leader said big questions remained.
Why was the decision to go to war at that point taken on the available information? Shouldn't the United Nations Weapons Inspectorate have been given more time? And does the case for an independent inquiry not remain absolutely paramount?
Some Conservatives are asking how Lord Hutton could reach these conclusions. One said his report could have been written by ALASTAIR Campbell himself.
The Prime Minister seems to have got away completely scot-free like a greased piglet when, in two important ways, Gilligan's story was right. The two most important ways: one, that ALASTAIR Campbell did indeed harden up that dossier, and two, there was some alarm and concern amongst members of the intelligence community about what he'd done. So I'm baffled.
But the government hopes this report will obliterate any previous perceptions, with not a single lordly bootprint to mar their reputation. Now, we have to remember the reason that the government was so angry with the BBC in the first place was because it saw this as an attack on Tony Blair's trustworthiness, something that the opposition had been saying for a long while. They now hope they can draw a line under this and rebuild his reputation.
Mark, thank you very much. Well, Lord Hutton's report has prompted some serious questions about the BBC's future, the way it's managed and the way it's governed. It's also the fundamental question of renewing the BBC's charter, which will shape the corporation's activities for the next decade. Bridget Kendall looks now at the likely impact on the BBC's future.
Shocked BBC staff leaving Television Centre in London tonight, still reeling from the day's drama. Some criticism of the BBC had been expected, but not Lord Hutton's devastating condemnation. Even outside observers like the former ITN editor-in-chief shared the surprise.
I cannot think of anything that compares with it at all. It's that serious. You could say it's frankly catastrophic for the BBC at such a crucial time in its future to be, in a sense, leaderless and to have so many question marks about its future.
This isn't the first BBC row with the government of the day. During the Falklands conflict, Mrs Thatcher's government accused the BBC of failing in its wartime duty of loyalty. The BBC insisted it was trying to be even-handed. A few years later, a government ban on the Real Lives documentary, on the grounds it was too uncritical of IRA terrorists, led to a BBC protest strike. And a Panorama programme, Maggie's Militant Tendency, ended in out-of-court damages to Tory MPs Neil Hamilton and Gerald Howarth. They claim they'd been unfairly linked to right-wing extremists. But today's crisis is of another order.
My worry is that it'll become a little bit of a feeding frenzy, and people who've always had it in for the BBC will take the opportunity to have a go. I think that would be unwise, because the BBC as an institution, as something that goes on into the future, is much more important.
And the timing could hardly be worse. The BBC's charter and licence fee are up for review, and the government tonight confirmed Lord Hutton's conclusions will be taken into account. Moreover, some critics are already calling for an outside body, not the governors, to oversee the BBC. Others say that wouldn't have helped in this case.
You only have to consider if an outside body had responsibility, what would have been the outcome of Hutton? Nothing. Because the outside body would have been the focus of all attention, not the BBC. The joy of the BBC's constitution is that it forces it to put its own house in order, which it must now do.
But what about the BBC's reputation? It's not just a major British institution, it's a highly respected global brand. A row between the BBC and the government can sometimes help its global reputation, but today's events are another matter. And arguably the most important task for the BBC now is to make sure that its reputation for impartiality and fairness that it's worked so hard at over the last 70 years survives all this. Bridget Kendall, BBC News at Television Centre.
Well, let's try and draw some of these strands together with our political editor, Andrew Marr, who's at Westminster. Andrew, where do today's events leave Mr Blair and the government on the one hand and the opposition on the other?
Well, so far as Mr Blair's concerned, let's not forget, Huw, that at the beginning of this week, quite a lot of people thought that he might not be Prime Minister by the end of the week. So he is in a vastly better position than a lot of people thought, than perhaps he expected. He's not entirely stronger. The tuition fees vote has caused him to rethink his position vis-à-vis the Labour Party. and reform at home. But when it comes to that crucial question Mark Mardell was talking about, trust and trustworthiness, this has dogged him. It's been a running sore now for years, but particularly since the Iraq war. And it has caused him intense damage and clearly a lot of personal embarrassment and pain too. Now, by some kind of alchemy, unfair or not, the Hutton inquiry became what everybody accepted was going to be the test of Tony Blair's honesty and credibility and trustworthiness. And today, he passed that test with flying colours.
And the opposition?
The opposition had a much tougher time. Michael Howard was booed, was fighting against a wall of noise in the Commons. Now, he has to decide whether attacks on the Prime Minister's integrity will work over the next 16 months or so before the general election, or whether it's time to move on to other issues.
Does this report today close the issue of weapons of mass destruction and the case for war?
Huw, emphatically, it does not. This was a narrow report into the circumstances surrounding the death of David Kelly. As I've said, it was also a report about the Prime Minister's trustworthiness, but it's not a report about why we went to war on Iraq or those missing weapons of mass destruction. And there are many, many people up and down the country who would still like a much fuller explanation of all of that.
And what is the view at Westminster tonight, Andrew, of the impact of this report on the BBC?
This is, it's hard to imagine, hard to look back and find a similar kind of crisis. I think probably you have to go back to Suez nearly 50 years ago to find something of this magnitude and seriousness. Of course, Tony Blair now has to appoint a new chairman of the governors. And beyond that, there's a lot of calls for a new system entirely for the BBC. I think it is an enormously dangerous moment for the BBC, and there is a real mood of anger, even vindictiveness, among some Labour MPs and ministers.
Andrew Marr at Westminster, thank you. Let's have a look at the rest of the day's news. The blizzards and freezing temperatures have finally arrived across much of Britain. In Scotland and northern England, hundreds of thousands of children were sent home from school, and tonight, wintry conditions reached southern England and the Midlands, forcing the closure of Birmingham Airport. Here's Robert Hall.
A sparkling carpet. By this evening, it stretched from the tip of Scotland to Kent. Dawn had brought the blizzards to Scottish communities, blinding snow driven into the faces of commuters and across the major routes that snowplows and gritters had successfully kept open.